Some souls never ask for much. They simply hope someone will notice before it's too late. The November air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and roasted coffee through a quiet town outside Asheville, North Carolina, where people hurried along the sidewalks with warm cups in their hands and little reason to slow down. Cars rolled past in a steady rhythm. Storefront windows reflected the pale afternoon sun, and somewhere down the block, an old church bell marked another peaceful hour. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter stepped out of a neighborhood diner after finishing a late lunch, his olive field jacket resting comfortably over broad shoulders shaped by years in the Marine Corps. At 34, he still walked with the calm awareness of someone trained to notice the smallest movement. Yet there was a quiet heaviness in his hazel eyes that no uniform could hide. Since leaving active deployment, silence had become his closest companion. Crowded places never bothered him, but empty evenings often did. He reached into his pocket, unfolded the remaining half of his turkey sandwich, and paused before taking another bite. Across the narrow street, beneath the faded shade of an old maple tree, stood a German shepherd unlike any he had ever seen. The dog was painfully thin, his sable coat dulled by dust and rain, yet his posture remained strangely dignified. His ears stood tall despite exhaustion, and his amber eyes never begged the way hungry strays usually did. Instead, they rested quietly on Daniel. There was no barking, no whining, no nervous pacing, only a patient gaze filled with something almost impossible to explain. It was the kind of look one person gives another when words have failed. Daniel glanced around, expecting an owner to appear, but families continued walking, bicycles rolled by, and no one seemed to notice the shepherd standing perfectly still beneath the tree. A little girl pointed toward the dog before her mother gently pulled her along. A businessman stepped around him without slowing his pace. The town continued breathing as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel looked back at the sandwich in his hand. Then he looked at the dog again. Somehow, the distance between them felt much smaller than the width of the street. The shepherd lowered his head for only a second before lifting it once more, his tired eyes meeting Daniel's with quiet hope rather than desperation. If those eyes could speak, they would have asked only one simple question. "Can I eat with you?" Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. Years earlier, overseas, he had learned that courage did not always arrive carrying a rifle. Sometimes it arrived on four tired legs, refusing to give up despite every reason to do so. He crossed the street without hesitation. The afternoon traffic faded into the background. The breeze slowed. Even the rustling leaves seemed to soften as he knelt a few feet away, careful not to frighten the dog. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently, his voice almost carried away by the wind. "Looks like you've had a rough week." The German shepherd did not rush forward. He did not lunge for the food. He simply watched Daniel's face as though deciding whether kindness could still be trusted. Then, almost cautiously, his tail gave the faintest single wag. Daniel broke the sandwich into two equal pieces and placed one carefully on the sidewalk before sitting down on the curb beside it. "Nobody should have to eat alone," he whispered. For several long seconds, the shepherd never touched the food. Instead, he looked beyond Daniel's shoulder, toward the distant tree line at the edge of town, as if someone else mattered even more than his own empty stomach. The shepherd finally lowered his head and gently picked up the piece of sandwich, but instead of swallowing it, he turned away from Daniel without a sound. His movements were slow, almost careful, conserving every ounce of strength he had left. Daniel watched in quiet confusion as the dog crossed the empty side street and disappeared between two weathered brick buildings where an old service alley stretched toward the edge of town. Most people would have assumed the animal simply wanted to eat alone. Daniel could not shake the feeling that something else was waiting beyond those walls. He stood, brushed the crumbs from his hands, and followed at a respectful distance. The alley smelled faintly of damp earth, aging wood, and the lingering sweetness of fallen leaves collecting against rusted fences. Afternoon sunlight filtered through bare branches, painting shifting patches of gold across cracked pavement. The shepherd never looked back to see if Daniel was following. Somehow, he seemed certain the Marine would keep walking. Every few yards, the dog slowed just enough to make sure the precious piece of sandwich remained balanced gently between his teeth. He never took a bite. That alone told Daniel everything he needed to know. Hunger had not been the shepherd's greatest concern. Someone else was hungrier. They continued for nearly half a mile until the neat neighborhoods gave way to abandoned warehouses and forgotten railroad tracks where tall grass swayed gently in the cool breeze. The sounds of traffic faded behind them, replaced by distant crows and the rhythmic creaking of old utility poles. Scout finally stopped beside a weathered freight container partially hidden behind overgrown blackberry bushes. He carefully placed the sandwich onto the ground before letting out the softest whine Daniel had heard all afternoon. It was not a cry of fear. It was a quiet invitation. Daniel approached slowly and knelt beside the opening beneath the container where years of rain had washed away the dirt. At first, he saw only darkness. Then two tiny pairs of amber eyes blinked from the shadows. Two German shepherd puppies, barely old enough to walk with confidence, cautiously inched forward on oversized paws. Their coats were dusty, their little ribs visible beneath soft sable fur, yet their tails began wagging the instant Scout nudged the sandwich toward them. Daniel felt his throat tighten as the puppies eagerly shared the food, while Scout simply watched, never attempting to reclaim a single bite for himself. The shepherd's eyes remained fixed on the puppies with quiet satisfaction, as though seeing them eat filled a hunger deeper than his own. Daniel sat back on the cool ground, overwhelmed by the silent lesson unfolding before him. During his years in the Marine Corps, he had witnessed extraordinary courage from men willing to sacrifice comfort for those beside them. He had never expected to recognize that same spirit in a forgotten dog standing beneath a rusted freight container. One puppy stumbled clumsily toward Daniel before retreating behind Scout's front legs. The older dog gently lowered his head to reassure the frightened little one, his nose brushing the puppy's ear with remarkable tenderness. Daniel reached into his jacket and found a package of beef jerky he had forgotten was still in his pocket. He broke it into small pieces and placed them carefully on the ground. Once again, Scout ignored every piece until both puppies had eaten first. Only after they wandered back beneath the shelter did the shepherd quietly accept the smallest remaining bite. As Daniel watched him chew slowly beneath the fading autumn light, one question settled heavily in his heart. If Scout had spent days searching for food without feeding himself, how many more secrets was this faithful dog still carrying alone? Daniel remained beside the old freight container until the last ribbon of sunlight disappeared behind the Blue Ridge foothills, watching Scout settle quietly across the entrance like a silent guardian. The puppies curled together against his side, their tiny bodies finally relaxed after what was likely their first full meal in days. A cool evening breeze drifted through the abandoned rail yard, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and distant chimney smoke across the empty tracks. Daniel slipped off his field jacket and gently spread it beneath the puppies, earning only a cautious glance from Scout. The shepherd neither growled nor retreated. Instead, he lowered his head in quiet acceptance, as though he had already decided that this stranger belonged among them. Daniel smiled faintly. Trust, he knew, was never demanded. It was earned one small act at a time. He pulled out his phone and searched for the nearest store that was still open. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying bottled water, canned dog food, puppy formula, a blanket, and a small flashlight. Scout stood as Daniel approached, his ears alert, but the familiar calm returned the moment he recognized the Marine's voice. Easy, buddy, Daniel whispered. Tonight nobody goes hungry. He carefully filled a shallow plastic container with water before opening several cans of food. Once again, Scout stepped aside, allowing the puppies to eat first. Only after they had wandered away with full little bellies did he quietly approach his own meal. Daniel noticed something else this time. The shepherd ate slowly, almost politely, never gulping, never guarding the bowl, every movement carrying the quiet discipline of an animal that had once belonged somewhere safe. Around his neck, nearly hidden beneath the thick sable fur, Daniel spotted the faint outline where a collar had rested for years. The hair beneath it was lighter, pressed flat by time. Someone had cared for this dog. Someone had taught him patience, obedience, and gentleness. Daniel gently reached toward the shepherd's shoulder. Scout flinched for only a heartbeat before relaxing again. His coat concealed several old scars, fully healed but impossible to ignore. None looked recent. They were simply reminders of a difficult road that had stretched far longer than one bad week. Daniel rubbed behind the shepherd's ear, and for the first time that evening Scout closed his eyes. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds spoke louder than words. He was exhausted, not simply from hunger, but from carrying responsibility that had become too heavy for one faithful soul. Night settled completely over the forgotten rail yard. Stars slowly appeared above the dark silhouettes of old warehouses while a freight train echoed somewhere many miles away. Daniel built no fire and made no unnecessary noise. He simply sat against the side of the weathered container with Scout lying a few feet away and the puppies sleeping peacefully between them. The silence felt strangely familiar. Years earlier, overseas, Daniel had spent countless nights beneath open skies listening to little more than the wind and the breathing of those beside him. Back then, staying awake meant protecting people he had promised never to leave behind. Tonight, without realizing it, that promise had quietly returned. Just after midnight, Scout suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the forest beyond the railroad tracks, and a low, uncertain whine escaped his throat. He rose without hesitation, glanced once at the sleeping puppies, then looked directly into Daniel's eyes before taking several slow steps toward the darkness. It was not the look of a dog wandering away. It was the look of someone asking another trusted friend to follow because one more life was still waiting to be found. Daniel rose quietly, leaving the blanket wrapped around the sleeping puppies before following Scout beyond the abandoned freight yard. The shepherd moved with surprising confidence despite his exhaustion, weaving through tall grass silvered by moonlight and across an old wooden footbridge that creaked softly beneath their weight. The forest ahead stood calm beneath a sky scattered with stars, while a cool mountain breeze carried the scent of pine, damp moss, and distant streams flowing somewhere beyond the trees. Every few yards Scout paused, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to be sure Daniel remained close behind. There was trust between them now, still fragile, but growing stronger with every silent step. Daniel switched on his small flashlight, letting the narrow beam glide across fallen branches and patches of soft earth. He noticed fresh paw prints, all belonging to Scout, forming the same trail again and again. The shepherd had traveled this route many times. Whatever waited ahead was not new. It had become part of his daily mission. Nearly 15 minutes later, the woods opened into a forgotten clearing where an old farmhouse leaned quietly beneath towering oak trees. Time had weathered every inch of the place. White paint peeled from the wooden walls. A broken porch swing drifted gently in the wind. Flower beds had long surrendered to weeds, yet traces of care remained in little details that refused to disappear. Wind chimes still hung beneath the porch roof, whispering softly whenever the breeze touched them. Scout slowed to a stop beside the front steps. He lifted his nose toward the porch and released a low, gentle whine unlike any sound Daniel had heard before. It was filled with longing rather than fear. Daniel climbed the worn wooden steps carefully. Beside the front door rested an old ceramic bowl with faded blue paw prints painted around its edge. It was empty now, but clean enough to suggest someone had cared for it not very long ago. Next to the bowl lay a weathered tennis ball, its bright yellow color faded by months beneath the sun. Scout nudged the ball once with his nose before sitting quietly beside it. His tail remained still. His amber eyes never left the front door. Daniel gently knocked. No answer came. He waited a full minute before trying again, listening only to the soft rustling of leaves overhead. The house remained silent. Looking through one of the front windows, he saw furniture covered with white sheets, family photographs still hanging on the walls, and a calendar frozen several months in the past. Nothing looked abandoned in anger. It looked abandoned by circumstance. Daniel walked slowly around the side of the house until he reached a small mailbox leaning slightly to one side. The metal flag had rusted halfway down. Inside rested several unopened envelopes addressed to Eleanor Whitmore. Most carried notices from local utility companies. One bore the return address of Asheville Regional Medical Center. Daniel carefully closed the mailbox without disturbing anything. Pieces of the story began settling quietly into place. Scout had not been born without love. Someone had fed him from that blue bowl. Someone had thrown that old tennis ball across the yard. Someone had taught him patience, gentle manners, and unwavering loyalty. Whatever had happened here had happened suddenly enough that Scout had never stopped waiting. As Daniel returned to the porch, Scout walked to the front door once more and sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the empty house as though every sunrise had begun with hope that it might finally open again. Daniel knelt beside him and rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck. Neither of them spoke, yet both seemed to understand the same heartbreaking truth. Sometimes the deepest hunger was not for food. Sometimes it was for the person who had once called you family. The first light of dawn slipped quietly through the oak branches, bathing the old farmhouse in a gentle golden glow that made the peeling white paint seem almost alive again. Scout remained on the porch exactly where Daniel had found him, watching the front door with patient eyes that had clearly repeated this same hopeful ritual every morning for months. Daniel sat beside him without speaking. Some kinds of grief did not need questions. They only needed company. As the morning air warmed, birds began singing from the nearby maple trees, filling the silence with soft melodies that somehow made the empty house feel even lonelier. Daniel reached into his backpack and placed fresh water beside the faded ceramic bowl before opening another can of dog food. Scout glanced at it only briefly before turning his attention back toward the distant railroad tracks. A faint bark echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Instantly, the shepherd stood and trotted away without hesitation. Daniel followed once again, his boots brushing through dew-covered grass sparkling beneath the rising sun. The familiar trail led back toward the abandoned freight container where the two puppies greeted Scout with excited little tails and playful yips. Daniel smiled as the older dog gently licked each puppy before stepping aside to allow them to eat breakfast first. Their small bodies already looked stronger than the day before. Their eyes carried curiosity instead of fear. Watching them wrestle clumsily through the blanket he had left overnight reminded Daniel how quickly hope could grow when someone simply chose to care. While the puppies explored nearby wildflowers, Scout wandered toward a patch of blackberry bushes and stopped beside a narrow opening almost hidden beneath tangled vines. He looked back at Daniel, then disappeared inside. Curious, Daniel pushed the branches aside and discovered a shallow space protected from wind and rain. There, tucked carefully against the dirt wall, rested several objects that immediately caught his attention. An old red leash, a weathered leather collar with a small brass buckle, a faded blue blanket carrying the unmistakable scent of home despite months outdoors. Scout gently nudged the blanket toward Daniel before sitting quietly beside it. Daniel carefully lifted the collar and brushed away the dust. A tarnished metal tag hung from one side. The engraving had faded, but after rubbing it gently with his thumb, several letters became visible. Scout. Beneath the name appeared a phone number that time had nearly erased and one final line. If found, please bring him home. Daniel stared at the tiny words for several long seconds. Scout watched him without moving, his amber eyes reflecting equal parts hope and uncertainty. It was as though the faithful shepherd had carried those final pieces of his old life here every single day, refusing to abandon the memory of the person who had once loved him. Daniel slipped the collar carefully into his backpack instead of fastening it around Scout's neck. Somehow it felt less like property and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He gently scratched behind the shepherd's ears and smiled. "We are going to find your story, buddy," he whispered softly. "And if there is anyone still looking for you, we will find them too." Scout leaned his head briefly against Daniel's shoulder before lifting it toward the morning breeze. Far beyond the trees, the distant church bell rang once, carrying across the quiet valley like the beginning of an answer neither of them had expected to receive. Daniel drove into Asheville just after sunrise with Scout resting quietly in the passenger seat and the two puppies sleeping together inside a secure travel crate lined with blankets in the back of his pickup truck. The roads were beginning to fill with commuters, and the soft glow of morning reflected across the Blue Ridge Mountains like a promise of gentler days ahead. Scout sat upright during the drive, calm but watchful, his amber eyes studying every familiar street they passed as though searching for a face he had never stopped believing he might see again. Daniel noticed the shepherd's ears lift each time they crossed an intersection or passed an older neighborhood, but the hopeful expression always faded a moment later. Their first stop was Cedar Valley Animal Clinic, a small veterinary office with white siding and flower boxes beneath every window. Dr. Emily Lawson, a veterinarian in her early 40s with kind blue eyes and years of quiet experience, welcomed them without hesitation. She examined the puppies first, smiling as each tiny heartbeat sounded strong through her stethoscope. They were underweight but healthy, their recovery already well underway. Scout waited patiently beside the examination table, never making a sound, never demanding attention for himself. When Dr. Lawson finally examined him, her gentle hands paused around the faded mark beneath his neck where the collar had rested for years. She looked carefully at the old scars hidden beneath his thick coat before meeting Daniel's eyes. "These are old," she said softly. "He has been through difficult seasons, but what surprises me most is his temperament. Dogs that have been alone this long usually lose trust. He is not. Someone loved him deeply before life changed." Daniel quietly placed the weathered collar on the examination table. Dr. Lawson cleaned the tarnished identification tag with a soft cloth until the engraving became easier to read. "Scout. If found, please bring him home." The faded phone number remained nearly impossible to recognize, but one additional line slowly appeared beneath years of wear. Eleanor Whitmore. Daniel felt the same name echo through his thoughts. It matched the mailbox outside the lonely farmhouse. Dr. Lawson looked at him thoughtfully. If that house belonged to Miss Whitmore, there may still be records somewhere. Property records, neighbors, maybe even the local church. Small towns remember people. Daniel nodded gratefully. Before leaving, he purchased enough food, medicine, and supplies to care for the little family for several weeks. Scout watched every movement quietly until Dr. Lawson placed a fresh leather collar around his neck. Instead of resisting, the shepherd lowered his head and stood perfectly still. When the buckle clicked into place, he blinked slowly and gently leaned against Daniel's leg. It was such a small gesture that most people would have missed it, yet Daniel understood exactly what it meant. For the first time in a very long while, Scout was no longer wearing the weight of survival alone. As they stepped back into the cool mountain morning, church bells drifted across the town square, their peaceful melody floating above brick sidewalks and maple trees glowing with late autumn color. Daniel opened the passenger door, and Scout climbed inside without being asked, settling comfortably into the seat as though he finally believed he belonged there. Daniel rested one hand on the steering wheel before quietly looking toward the old farmhouse in the distance. He had rescued a hungry dog, but somehow the journey had become something much greater. They were no longer searching only for food. Together they were searching for the last missing chapter of a family that neither of them was ready to leave behind. The afternoon sun drifted lower as Daniel followed one quiet lead after another through the small mountain town. At the county records office, an elderly clerk with silver hair and gentle eyes listened patiently while turning the weathered collar over in her hands. The moment she read the faded name, her expression softened with recognition. "Eleanor Whitmore," she whispered. "I remember her." She smiled sadly before opening an old property file stored inside a wooden cabinet polished smooth by decades of use. She taught music at the elementary school for almost 30 years. Everyone knew Miss Eleanor. Children loved her. So did every stray animal within 10 miles. Daniel listened without interrupting. The clerk continued carefully, as though speaking too loudly might disturb precious memories. Nearly 8 months earlier, Eleanor had become seriously ill and had been transferred to a long-term rehabilitation center outside Asheville after neighbors found her too weak to continue living alone. The decision had happened quickly. Volunteers believed Scout had wandered into the surrounding forest during the confusion. They searched for days, but never found him. Eventually, everyone assumed he had disappeared into the mountains forever. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the old collar resting quietly in his hands. Scout had never disappeared. He had simply stayed where love had last existed. Before leaving, the clerk handed Daniel a neatly folded card with the name of the rehabilitation center where Eleanor still lived. "She asks about that dog every time someone visits," the woman said softly. Even now, the drive took nearly 40 minutes through winding roads lined with brilliant red maples and golden hickory trees. Scout remained unusually alert throughout the journey, sitting perfectly upright beside Daniel, while the puppies slept peacefully in the back seat after another full meal. It was almost as if the shepherd sensed every mile was carrying him closer to an answer his faithful heart had never stopped believing in. When Daniel parked outside the quiet rehabilitation center, the building looked warm rather than clinical. Flower gardens bordered the sidewalks, rocking chairs rested along the front porch, and wind chimes whispered beneath the wide, covered entrance. Nurses greeted residents by name, while the scent of fresh bread drifted from the dining room windows. It felt less like an institution and more like a place where hope had learned to walk slowly. Daniel spoke briefly with the receptionist before a nurse named Grace appeared with tears already forming in her eyes the moment she saw Scout waiting calmly beside him. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "That cannot be." Scout remained still, watching the hallway ahead with complete focus. Grace covered her mouth gently. "Miss Eleanor still keeps his picture beside her bed. Every evening she tells him good night, even though she believes he cannot hear her." Daniel swallowed quietly. Grace disappeared for a few moments before returning with a wheelchair occupied by a small, elderly woman wrapped in a soft blue cardigan. Her white hair rested neatly against her shoulders, and although age had gently stolen much of her strength, kindness still shined clearly within her pale green eyes. She looked toward Daniel first, then toward the shepherd standing beside him. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire hallway became perfectly still. Scout did not bark. He did not run. He simply stared as though afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. Eleanor slowly lifted one trembling hand. "Scout," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. The shepherd's ears lifted instantly. His tail began moving in slow, uncertain sweeps before his entire body seemed to melt with recognition. He walked forward one careful step at a time until he reached her wheelchair. Then he gently rested his head across her knees with the quiet relief of someone who had finally found home after carrying hope farther than anyone believed possible. Eleanor buried both hands into the thick sable fur around his neck, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You waited for me," she whispered again and again. "Oh, my sweet boy, you waited." Daniel turned away for a moment, pretending to admire the autumn sunlight pouring through the hallway windows because some reunions deserved privacy, and because after years of carrying burdens he could never quite set down, he finally understood that miracles were rarely loud. Sometimes they arrived on four faithful paws and quietly kept a promise that the world had already forgotten. Life inside the rehabilitation center changed in quiet ways after that afternoon. Every morning, before breakfast was served, Scout walked calmly beside Eleanor through the flower garden, never straying more than a few inches from her wheelchair. Nurses who had grown accustomed to silent hallways now smiled whenever they heard the gentle click of his paws crossing polished wooden floors. Residents who rarely left their rooms began sitting outside simply to watch the faithful shepherd resting beside the woman he had waited so long to find again. Even the autumn wind seemed softer as it drifted through the maple trees surrounding the courtyard. Daniel visited every evening after finishing work, bringing fresh groceries from the local market and spending an hour helping Eleanor with anything she needed. During those visits, he learned stories that no official record could ever preserve. Eleanor spoke about the day she found Scout as a frightened young puppy trembling beneath the porch after a summer thunderstorm years earlier. She had wrapped him in an old blue blanket, the very same blanket Daniel had discovered hidden beneath the blackberry bushes. She laughed gently as she remembered how Scout refused to sleep anywhere except beside the front door because he believed protecting the house was the greatest job a dog could ever receive. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Every memory explained another piece of the shepherd's remarkable devotion. Scout had never stayed at the farmhouse because he was lost. He had stayed because he believed promises were permanent. A few weeks later, the two puppies were healthy enough to explore the grassy fields behind the old farmhouse under Daniel's careful watch. Their playful energy filled the once-forgotten property with life again. They chased falling leaves, stumbled over each other with clumsy enthusiasm, and often climbed across Scout as though he were the strongest tree in the forest. For the first time since Daniel had met him, the shepherd joined their games. His tail wagged freely. His eyes carried light instead of worry. He no longer scanned every road searching for someone who might never return because the waiting was finally over. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Daniel drove Eleanor back to the farmhouse for a short visit approved by her doctors. As the truck rolled slowly into the familiar driveway, Scout lifted his head and quietly rested one paw against the passenger door before it even opened. Eleanor smiled through grateful tears as she looked across the porch, the old swing, the wind chimes, and the maple tree whose leaves had begun turning brilliant shades of gold. Home always remembers love, she whispered. Together they walked slowly across the porch. Scout stopped beside the faded blue food bowl exactly where he had waited so many mornings. Daniel filled it with fresh water while Eleanor gently rested her hand upon the shepherd's neck. The puppies chased each other through the yard before collapsing happily beside the porch steps beneath the warm afternoon sun. Daniel watched the peaceful scene with a heart far lighter than it had been only weeks before. He had believed he was rescuing a hungry dog. Instead, he had helped restore an entire family held together not by walls or possessions, but by unwavering loyalty. As the golden light settled across the quiet valley, Scout lay at Eleanor's feet, closed his eyes, and drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he had known in a very long time, finally certain that when he opened them again, the people he loved would still be there. Winter arrived quietly over the Blue Ridge Mountains, dusting the rooftops of Asheville with a thin layer of frost that sparkled beneath the early morning sun. The maple tree outside Eleanor's farmhouse stood bare now, its branches reaching toward a pale blue sky, while smoke drifted gently from the stone chimney Daniel had repaired before the first cold front arrived. Inside the little house, warmth had returned in ways that had nothing to do with the fire crackling softly in the living room. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen counter. A kettle hummed peacefully on the stove. Framed family photographs once hidden beneath white sheets now rested proudly on the shelves again. Scout lay stretched comfortably near the front door exactly where he had always believed his place should be, though this time his eyes carried no worry. The two growing puppies tumbled clumsily across the braided rug before collapsing against his side, safe beneath the quiet protection that had never once failed them. Daniel stepped onto the porch carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. One he handed carefully to Eleanor, whose strength had slowly returned enough for her doctors to approve weekends at home. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup and smiled as she watched Scout lift his head toward the morning breeze. Church bells echoed faintly across the valley just as they had on the day Daniel first chose to cross the street instead of walking away. So much had changed because of one simple decision. Daniel often thought back to that quiet afternoon outside the diner. At the time, he believed he had seen a hungry dog searching for food. Now he understood that he had actually witnessed something far greater. He had seen faith refusing to disappear. Scout had never begged for himself. Every meal he searched for had been shared before he ever tasted it. Every road he walked had carried him back to love instead of away from it. Every sunrise he greeted had been filled with hope that one day the front door would open again. That kind of loyalty could not be trained. It could only be lived. As the weeks became months, Daniel found healing in places he had stopped looking years earlier. The quiet wait that had followed him since leaving military service slowly gave way to peaceful routines. Mornings began with long walks through the fields beside Scout. Afternoons were spent repairing fences, planting flowers, and laughing as the young shepherds transformed every chore into an unexpected game. Evenings ended on the porch where Eleanor often played gentle hymns on her old upright piano while Scout rested faithfully at her feet, and Daniel watched the stars appear one by one above the silent mountains. No one spoke very much during those evenings because nothing important needed to be explained anymore. Everything that mattered could already be seen in small, ordinary moments. A shared meal around a worn wooden table. Fresh water waiting inside a familiar blue bowl. Gentle hands resting on a faithful head. Quiet footsteps following one another through the grass without fear of being left behind again. On the first anniversary of the day they met, Daniel quietly fastened a new brass tag onto Scout's collar. It carried only 4 simple words beneath his name. Home is wherever love remains. Scout looked up at him, his amber eyes shining with the same quiet kindness that had first stopped a Marine in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Then the shepherd leaned gently against Daniel's side before walking toward Eleanor, who welcomed him with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. The winter sun settled softly across the farmhouse porch, wrapping the little family in peaceful golden light. And for the first time in a very long while, every heart beneath that roof understood the beautiful certainty that sometimes the smallest act of mercy does not simply save a life. It becomes the place where several souls finally find their way home together.